thank you firstly to Brian and Anna Horton, of course, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, second time for me, and with such a distinguished audience. Well, porcelain or china cabinets, and by cabinet I mean a room, they're usually associated with the end of the 17th and the early 18th centuries. Here are two examples in Oranienburg, north of Berlin, and the slightly later room in Charlottenburg in Berlin itself. The culmination of this fashion was, of course, the Japanese palace in Dresden a little bit later, and we'll be hearing about that this afternoon, I think, from Frau Simonius. So that was the Japanese palace, of course, not just one room, but an entire palace was devoted to the display of porcelain. I want to make just the point now that the display of porcelain at this time in the Baroque era was an integral part of the Baroque ceremonial function of palaces. It was intended to represent the reigning house through splendid and rich displays in public or semi-public areas. But today I want to look at what happened afterwards in the second half of the 18th century, when the fashion for such densely packed rooms as these had passed, and also when the lives of the reigning princes and their families became less bound by formal representation of this kind, and court etiquette became less strict. So as Brian mentioned, by way of example, I'm looking at Karoline Luise, the Margravine of Baden in southwestern Germany, and she was Margravine from 1751. Just a quick geography note, you can see the Holy Roman Empire here, Baden along the Rhine River on the border with Alsace, and it's a patchwork, as you can see, and typical of many principalities. And it's important to note there are two Badens. There's Baden-Baden, which is the Catholic line, and Baden-Durlach, which is the Protestant line, which I'll be talking a bit more about. Karoline Luise provides an interesting example of how porcelain was acquired and displayed in the second half of the 18th century, and of how much perceptions of the material and methods of display, as well as taste and fashion, changed between the earlier Baroque era of porcelain cabinets and the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. As Brian mentioned, she was an extraordinarily talented and unusual princess. And in her youth, here you can see the famous painting by Lyotard, who also taught her how to paint, incidentally. She was known as the Minerva of Hessen, and she, I think it's not an exaggeration to say, she became one of the great personalities of the Enlightenment. Perhaps unusually for a woman for her time, she received a very thorough and broad education. She spoke 5 languages, she was a good musician and a talented artist, and probably in part this was due to her father, the Landgraf Ludwig VIII of Hessen-Darmstadt, who also allowed her to choose her husband, which I think was also a bit unusual. After her wedding in 1751 to the Markgraf Karl Friedrich of Baden, and it turned into a very happy and long marriage, a loving marriage, she pursued a variety of artistic, scientific, and literary studies with astonishing energy. She was particularly interested in the natural sciences, so botany, zoology, physics, medicine, mineralogy, geology, and chemistry. And she even installed a laboratory in the Karlsruhe residence, the main residence where she lived, in which she conducted experiments, chemical experiments. And she also had her own artist's studio installed there. She also corresponded with many of the great generation of scientists and philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire, Goethe, and the Swiss theologian Johann Caspar Lavater. And many of these people she knew personally. Voltaire, for example, visited her in Karlsruhe. Karoline Luise is probably best known now as a collector of paintings and books. She had a private income that she used to collect, although it wasn't unlimited, and when at the end of the 7 Years' War, collectors such as Catherine the Great of Russia were able to rejoin the Paris art market, Karoline Luise unfortunately was priced out, so maybe sent a feeling that's familiar to many of us. Nonetheless, she was Her collection of over 200 paintings included many Dutch and Flemish 17th century masters. You can see a few here on the screen, painters such as Rembrandt, David Teniers. And she also included French contemporary artists such as Boucher and Chardin, whose studio she even visited in Paris. She said of her painting collection, "I regard it as a book collector does his library, as a source of knowledge." Unlike the paintings collection, much of her substantial collection of Asian and European porcelain was actually inherited. And just to give you an idea of volume, in inventories, the collection includes about 1,700 entries. And some of these entries consist of many pieces and even entire services. So looking at her porcelain collection in detail now, I think in order to understand the collection she had and the way she displayed it and how that was different, we have to briefly go back a couple generations to the original collectors. I should say at the outset that all of these collectors, these ladies I'm talking about, collected fine and decorative arts and had very large collections. I'll allude to some of these, but for the purpose of this discussion, I just want to focus on the European porcelain. So our earliest collector is probably well known to many of you, Sibylla Augusta, the Margravine of Baden-Baden. So we're now in the Catholic part of Baden. One of the great porcelain collectors of the 18th century. And you can see from Johann Georg Keisler's account in 1729 that the collection was already well known in its day. And thanks in part to the splendid palace, Schloss Favorit, that she built to house the collection. Favorit was finished by about 1720, and the interiors were done over the next 10 years or so. And as you can see, the result was a very richly decorated Baroque residence. And it was distinguished by the Margravine's love of precious stones and materials, as you can see here on the right in the Florentine cabinet. And that relates also to her interest in stoneware and porcelain, incidentally. And also, Favorit was an example of the chinoiserie style, the fashion for Asian-inspired decoration in which porcelain played such a central role. This fashion, this chinoiserie fashion, was expressed in the interiors, in chinoiserie ceilings, lacquer furniture, Chinese wallpaper, Chinese and Japanese textiles, and finally the large collection of porcelain and files that the palace housed. This included Chinese and early Meissen porcelain and stoneware, German files, Dutch Delft, and even some Mexican pottery. All this reminds us a little, of course, of the Japanese palace of Augustus the Strong, and I think these were the only two palaces that were conceived from the start as porcelain palaces at this time, where the fascination for ceramics is directly integrated in the architecture. So you can see, for example, details of the ceiling decoration where pots or dishes are painted on as well, and they were displayed in those rooms. So in Favorit, the porcelain was displayed not only in the porcelain cabinet, the porcelain room, which is on the top left of the screen. It's changed a lot over time, but it was also displayed throughout many other rooms of the palace, and mostly in the typical Baroque manner over the chimneys, in combination with other objects of materials such as alabaster and soapstone and tortoiseshell. We know from the castle inventories and from what survived that Sibylla Augusta's collection included about 1,500 pieces of porcelain and about 700 examples of stoneware and files. Now, the great bulk of this was Chinese export porcelain of the transitional and Kangxi periods, but it did include a significant collection of early Meissen stoneware and porcelain. You can see some mostly Böttger stoneware on display here. And we think she probably had about 160 pieces of early Meissen stoneware and porcelain, but the inventories, the descriptions, unfortunately, are too vague to be certain about the objects. We also know that the Margravine purchased porcelain or stoneware in Dresden between 1716 and 1728, and she very likely received gifts of Meissen stoneware and porcelain from Augustus the Strong, whom she knew and met several times and corresponded with. Here just an example of a porcelain tea service, an early service, that she probably acquired about 1728. Turning now to the second substantial collection that Karoline Luise inherited, it was assembled by her husband's grandmother, the Margravine Magdalena Wilhelmina of Baden-Durlach. So we've moved to the Protestant half of Baden. Magdalena Wilhelmina had inherited a quantity of Chinese porcelain from her mother, who was a Duchess of Württemberg, the country next door, and she also inherited porcelain from her husband's mother and his aunt. Magdalena Wilhelmina obviously loved the material because as early as 1717 she'd installed a Kunst- und Porcelain Cabinet, an art and porcelain cabinet, next door to her bedroom in the Durlach residence. And it was in this room that she displayed her most precious works of art and objects and paintings and so on. This is another room from the same period. It's not related, but just to give you an idea of how these rooms may have looked. We fortunately, from a 1733 inventory, have a detailed description of what was in the room in her Kunst- und Porzellan cabinet. And it included not only porcelain, but countless objects of agate, such as snuff and powder boxes, dishes, pedestals, and so on, glass, soapstone, terra sigillata, amber, coconut shells, and ostrich shells mounted in silver. There were also 47 portrait miniatures, 51 wax miniatures, and countless paintings, so family portraits, religious still lives, but especially, religious paintings, but especially flower still lives, late 17th century Dutch flower still lives. The objects, including the porcelain, were displayed as in favourite above the chimneys, but also throughout the room on tables of tortoiseshell, silver, and lacquer, and on two lacquered black and gold pyramids, so some kind of étagère. There were also 6 other pyramids around the room and corner tables and trays. There were cases, leather cases containing complete toilet garnitures, as well as tea and coffee sets, and others with sewing equipment and silver-mounted glass bottles. And porcelain tea and coffee sets were also arranged on these lacquer pyramids and mixed together with figures. This dense arrangement of costly paintings, objects, and materials must have been very impressive indeed and very rich, but by the time of the Margravine's death in 1742, I think already quite old-fashioned. Like Sibylla Augusta in Baden-Baden, the rooms of her apartment still had a Baroque ceremonial function in which there isn't really much room for the private sphere. These were still semi-public spaces that had to represent the reigning House of Baden through a rich and splendid display. The inventory of the Durlach Palace is a bit more detailed than that of Favorit, so it's easier to identify or distinguish the Chinese from the Meissen and other European porcelain. And just to give you a sense of the volume again, of a total of over 1,100 entries listing porcelain, the great bulk of it is Chinese. There are 197 entries for Dresdner porcelain, so Meissen porcelain, and some of these include complete services, as you can see on the screen on the left. And also, I showed you on the previous slide, quite a lot decorated in Augsburg in gilding by Hausmaler, by the goldsmiths there. There were also 17 entries listing Dupaquier porcelain, so the first Viennese factory founded in 1719, as well as a handful of mentions of French porcelain, so probably Saint-Cloud. Interestingly, the Margravine appears to have actively collected or acquired things up to the end of her life, because there were several Meissen figures and groups dating to around 1740, which are identifiable in the inventories. And I'm showing you here just some examples of those models to give you a flavor of what she was collecting. But she died in 1742, so she obviously kept going to the end. So these were by far the largest groups of porcelain that Karoline Luise inherited, and she didn't inherit it at once, but over a period of years. If we now turn our attention back to her, it becomes apparent that, like her paintings collection, she also regarded the porcelain collection mainly as a source of knowledge. And most of this great, these thousands of pieces of porcelain that she inherited actually became part of her Naturalia cabinet. And a small part, only about 170 pieces, were displayed in her private apartments or were stored in her private apartments, in the rooms and in a porcelain cabinet. And I'll come to that in a little while. Turning firstly to the Naturalia, or Natural History cabinet, it was probably first displayed on the first floor, above her apartments on the first floor. You can see where her private apartments were on the right. And below the roof, it's thought the Naturalia cabinet was first displayed there. But in 1765, the library building on the left of the screen was finished, and the Naturalia cabinet moved there adjacent to the east wing. And I think it's significant, it's physically quite far from her private apartments. Such cabinets are reminiscent, of course, of 17th century cabinets of curiosities or Kunstkammer, but they were also a typical product of the Enlightenment and the spirit of scientific inquiry. And their goal was really the compilation and ordering of knowledge about areas such as botany, zoology, mineralogy, and conchology. You might be asking yourselves, well, what has all that got to do with porcelain? And the answer is that Karoline Luise regarded the historic porcelain collections that she'd inherited, which, as we've seen, were assembled and displayed in a very typical Baroque manner. She saw them in a radically different way, and we might say through the lens of the Enlightenment, or at least with the eyes of a scientist. Here you can see, by the way, a Meissen service after prints by Hofnagel of the 17th century, which is listed in the inventory of the Naturalia cabinet, so it included entire services. I'm showing here on the right a reconstruction of another Naturalia cabinet from a German castle from around the same period, just to give you an idea of what it actually looks like, and it would have been many rooms, of course. We're fortunate in the case of Karoline Luise that we've got a detailed description of her intentions with the Naturalia cabinet and the porcelain. And this was written down by the court official who was responsible for maintaining and cataloguing the Naturalia cabinet. And it's a long quote, but I'd like to read it out because it really gives us a very good idea of how she saw the material. In this regard, one should not, pray, think that this porcelain arrangement was made in order to look at and admire the shape of the vessels or the porcelain figures, as it were, in order to exhibit them in a becoming way in a cabinet of rarities. Rather, this entire lofty endeavor had from the start the intention of showing the similarities and contrasts that the porcelains have between each other, as, for example, the Chinese and Japanese against the Saxon and Meissen, and these against the Berlin, the English and the Dutch against the Viennese and the French, the Frankenthal against the Ludwigsburg and Baden, Réaumur's porcelain against stoneware, stoneware against faience, and so on. In order to establish this, the weight of the porcelain, the thickness of the forms, the degree of glassiness, and the breaks, whether they appeared granular or irregular and porous or matte, all this was observed and reflected upon. One spoke of Petunze and kaolin. The marks and symbols that each porcelain manufactory makes somewhere on each vessel and figure were recorded on a special diagram. With regard to the porcelain colors and the fired colors, namely those that appear through melting, the mineral purple, the safflower, the copper and the iron saffron, the pewter ash, the lead calcium, the frit and its preparation, as well as the greater or lesser fire resistance, the chilling in cold, and reversed the rapid heating of cold into warm, all came under discussion, end of quote. So all the vases, wares, and figures were for the Margravine really nothing other than a sort of technical and instructional collection. And so in that sense, they belong to the Naturalia cabinet in its broadest sense. In accordance with her encyclopedic approach, Karoline Luise added examples of the newest products and techniques of porcelain manufacturing to the historic collections she'd inherited. So, for example, in 1780, she purchased some examples of Cozzi porcelain in Venice. And you can see on the top left the invoice from Gimignano Cozzi that has survived among her papers. The porcelain I couldn't find anywhere, but at least the invoice is there. There's also an example of the latest Wedgwood black basalt ware. You can see a vase from her collection, along with a page in French of Wedgwood's catalogue, which also was among her papers. The Margravine's scientific interest in porcelain is underscored by the fact that she also tried very hard to obtain samples of china clay from the Frankenthal, Meissen, and Sèvres porcelain factories. So you can see her request to an architect in Paris to get some Sèvres china clay. In 1771, a young Saxon privy councillor, Count Wilhelm Christoph von Stolberg in Dresden, actually did succeed in obtaining a sample of Meissen porcelain clay for Karoline Luise. She'd actually asked him 2 years earlier, and in his letter accompanying the sample, he alludes to the many difficulties that he faced in fulfilling her request, and then goes on to beg her not to reveal that he was the source, because she'd obviously put him in a very difficult position indeed. She was thrilled with this addition to the Naturalia cabinet, though, and she wrote in her reply that her aim was to bring together all imaginable sorts of clays and stones. The same year, in 1771, the Frankenthal porcelain modeler, Carl Gottlieb Lück, visited the Margravine in Karlsruhe, and he offered on his next visit to explain the porcelain arcanum and to demonstrate the use of enamel colors to her in person. From the nature of the display, I think we can be sure that the porcelain in the Naturalia cabinet, of course, wasn't used. It was just for display. Then just some other examples that she acquired for that cabinet. The porcelain Karoline Luise acquired for her private apartments represents a quite different and a much more modest aspect of collecting. It was a necessary attribute of her position, and it reflects the contemporary fashions in interior decoration and table culture, rather than being a personal collecting passion, as we'll see. Karoline Luise's tastes were strongly Francophile, and she was advised by numerous agents in Paris and elsewhere on her art collections and on the furnishing of the Karlsruhe residence. Unlike the earlier traditional Baroque residences we've seen that sought to project the status and power of the ruler and so required large and impressive displays of porcelain, the Karlsruhe residence embodied a shift from really political to cultural values, if you like, and it was decorated in the spirit of noble simplicity, so based on the Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon, of course. The West Wing, which included the Margravine's apartments, were finished by about 1772. Now, in her correspondence and papers, there are actually very few mentions of porcelain at all. In November 1768, Karoline Luise wrote to one of her agents in Paris, the banker and collector Jean-Henri Héberts, to inquire about the latest fashions for exhibiting porcelain. She was told that pieces should be distributed on chimney pieces, commodes, corner cupboards, console tables, and tables, arranged between bronze figures, vases, and flower vases. The letters on the left, you probably can't, it's probably illegible, but Héberts wrote, "One only rarely sees porcelain heaped up in a single room. All friends of art make a point of distributing the porcelain throughout their rooms and to place the finest objects at breast height so as to bring their qualities to the fore." As we've seen in 1770, Karoline Luise wrote to the architect of the Karlsruhe residence, Louis-Philippe de la Guipierre, asking for a sample of Sèvres china clay, but she also wanted a price list, so she was interested in Sèvres porcelain. And we know there was at least one other agent in Paris who acquired porcelain for her. On her first visit to Paris in 1771, when she went with her whole family, and they stayed for 3 months, in addition to visiting the king and the Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, Karoline Luise took the opportunity to purchase furniture, textiles, and other furnishings, as well as porcelain, from various marchands merciers for the Karlsruhe residence. On this trip, she also met the Comte de Milly at the Academy of Sciences, and he, of course, famously published The Secret of Hard-Paste Porcelain for the first time in 1772 in his book, L'Art de la Porcelaine. And in fact, on the visit, they discussed his forthcoming book, and he sent her a copy of the book in February 1772 when it was finished, and notes in his letter that he'd presented the king with a copy just 10 days earlier. An invoice survives from her next visit to Paris in 1776 for the purchase of a 3-piece garniture of Sèvres vases with a blue ground and goat handles, according to the invoice, for the considerable sum of 924 livres. These probably correspond to the 3 vases that are recorded in the Sèvres sales register as having been purchased for the same amount by the dealer Tenier in the first 6 months of that year. And I'm grateful to Ros Saville for finding that reference, bringing that to my attention. In the center, I'm showing you a garniture that corresponds to the description more or less and the date and the approximate price, just to give you an idea of what her taste was, although obviously I don't know if this was the garniture in question. Other than Sèvres and French porcelain, Karoline Luise acquired some Meissen porcelain for use. In 1776, through a Countess von Dalwitz in Dresden. In March of that year, von Dalwitz sent the Margravine a price list of Meissen porcelain. You can see handwritten by the factory accountants on the right. And in her letter, she described the latest fashions in porcelain, so plates with plain rather than molded ornamental rims, and blue ground vases painted with medallions, which you could have with more or less gilding, depending on the price. And here's an example of the type, just to show you what it's like, which is in Villeneuve Palace. Karoline Luise's correspondence also mentions the purchase of in Strasbourg of a solitaire from the nearby Niederwiller factory. You can see it on the bottom left, as well as purchases of Frankenthal porcelain. It's not always clear whether these purchases were to supplement the porcelain collection in the Naturalia cabinet, so just adding the newest examples of techniques and manufactories, or whether they were for decoration in the private apartments or simply for use. The inventory of Karoline Luise's apartments made after her death in 1783, as I mentioned, list only 171 entries for porcelain in her private possession, and that includes allerlei ordinaire porcelain, so all sorts of ordinary porcelain. In other words, what was used at the table, and you can see a part of a Ludwigsburg service, which would have been used on the right. Surprisingly, only very few pieces were actually displayed throughout the rooms. Most of the porcelain was stored in numerous large built-in cupboards that also contained semi-precious stones, works of art, decorative objects, and snuff boxes, along with the glass and porcelain for daily use at the table. And this came, as I mentioned, from Meissen, Ludwigsburg, Frankenthal, and the local factory in Baden-Baden. Possibly things were just bought out and used for decoration for a while and then put back in the cupboards, but surprisingly little was actually displayed. Although the fashion for such rooms had passed, there was a porcelain cabinet in the Margravine's private apartments. It was a narrow rectangular room on one side of the garden pavilion. You can see it's highlighted on the left of your screen. It wasn't actually completed by the time of Karoline Luise's death in 1783, and we know from an inventory a few years later that the brackets, which were to be fixed to the wall on which the porcelain stood, they hadn't even been installed yet. Rather touchingly, her apartments were left untouched by her husband, and even when he remarried, his new wife wasn't allowed to move in there or change them. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what was displayed in the porcelain cabinet, but I think it probably included porcelain that Karoline Luise had inherited from her parents, her grandparents, and her mother-in-law. And I'm just showing you a few examples, some quite old, obviously, from the early 18th century. So it's really a small survival of the Baroque tradition of the porcelain cabinet and the use of porcelain, especially to represent the status, and in this case, the lineage of the princely family. But the truth is that her main interest, as we've seen in the material, was mainly scientific. So we can see in the example of the princely family of Baden, and especially with Karoline Luise, some of the changes in the way porcelain was collected and exhibited during the 18th century, moving from Baroque porcelain palaces and cabinets to the gradual loosening of court ceremonial, the influence of French interior design, and especially the scientific approach to collecting that anticipates collecting and museum display in the 19th and indeed in our own 19th century and in our own time. Karoline Luise was the last in her family to have a particular interest in ceramics and porcelain. And like her predecessors, whose collection she inherited, she wanted her porcelain collection, as well as her paintings, her naturalia cabinet, all of this to be kept together and preserved for her eldest son and for the princely house. Although the princes of Baden did acquire more porcelain over time, especially gifts from Napoleon a bit later on, her collection, Karoline Luise's collection, was now treated as a closed historic collection. And the next time it was exhibited was only in 1879, when her grandson, the Grand Duke Frederick I of Baden, put his ancestors' porcelain on public display in the residence in Karlsruhe, in a museum devoted to the historic collections of his ancestors. So in a way, what we see is a revival of the Baroque practice of representational display. The residence, unfortunately, was destroyed in 1944, but you can still see parts of these magnificent collections in the museum in Karlsruhe, and of course in Schloss Favorit. Thank you.